I'm Michelle Crawford, and today we'll be continuing the Watercolor for Real Beginners video series. In the first video, we talked about all of the watercolor supplies that you really need when you're starting out with watercolor. Today, we're going to take a different approach and talk about watercolor supplies you don't really need, but are really nice to have. So let's get started. One of the things that I think is really nice to have, and it's going to actually help save you money, is a paper cutter. So oftentimes, watercolor paper, if you buy really high quality stuff, can get somewhat expensive. So buying larger sheets and being able to cut it down into smaller sizes is really nice. A paper cutter is going to give you a nice straight edge and really help, especially when it comes to framing and things like that, if you need to do some measurement or even trimming your artwork after you have painted something and maybe you just want to make it a specific size. So one of my favorite things to have is a paper cutter. Next, I know that some of us love to paint, but drawing is not our forte. So one of the things that I really like to have, which is helpful for transferring an image to watercolor paper, is a light box. It's essentially just a flat surface that you're going to put your image on. You're going to put your watercolor paper on top, tape it down. There's a light, and so it lights up. You can see through it and trace the image. If you're working on maybe a watercolor block or you don't have a light box, it is also nice to have transfer paper. There's lots of different types of transfer paper. A lot of them are actually not graphite. So I recommend a graphite transfer paper. Graphite's the same material that's in a pencil. So it's going to be easy to remove if you make a mistake or if you just want to lighten your drawing. But this transfer paper is graphite and it's wax free. So it's not going to stick to the paper. It's going to be, again, easy to work with, easy to remove. Graphite paper can be kind of messy, so keep that in mind. But one of the things that I always keep in my arsenal in case I'm working on a watercolor block and I do want to transfer an image, you can't really put it on a light box, so transfer paper is really nice. Also, sometimes I use a pencil and just transfer the image by drawing on top of the pencil, but also it's nice to have a stylus. So I use this for lots of different things, but I do use it to transfer. So I have a few of them. I think I bought a 4-pack, and they all have different size. I guess it's the nib or the tip of the side, so you can use it to transfer. But I also think that this is a really useful tool for masking fluid. So masking fluid, you don't need it, but it is nice to have if you are, trying to block out a certain area. So applying it can be difficult. I like to use this tool sometimes, especially if I'm going to be playing like little dots for stars in a night landscape. So this could be a tool. I also, for masking fluid, like to use a ruling pen. So essentially with the ruling pen, you just adjust this little dial. It makes the space in between the tip bigger or smaller, and you just dip this into your masking fluid. You could also do this with, ink or watercolor, but you essentially dip it in, and then it helps you create a nice evenly width line of your masking fluid. Makes it really easy to apply. One of my favorite tools is Masquepen. This is got a needle point applicator, and there's actually a little needle in the lid there so that it doesn't get clogged. That's really important. But Masquepen is also really helpful. I think they come in a couple different sizes on the nib, but this is also a great way to apply masking fluid. And then once it's dry, you always want to make sure masking fluid is completely dry on its own, no heat tool, before you work with it. But when you go to remove it, it can also, sometimes be difficult to remove, or you don't necessarily want to get the oils of your hands on your paper. So having, this is just like a rubber kind of eraser tool. You'll see it in your art supply store, but it's essentially like a rubber cement removal tool, and you will just like rub this on the paper on top of the masking fluid, and it'll stick to this and help you remove it. So great tools to have for masking fluid. Again, you don't need these things, just things that are nice to have. And if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, like it. I'm putting a whole series out there of for Watercolor for Real Beginners, and also I have a Watercolor for Real Beginners Facebook group, so check that out if you haven't already. Another nice thing to have is a magic eraser. I've done a couple other videos on this, but there are times when you've made a mistake, and or you want to be able to remove dried watercolor from your paper. Although you do want to be gentle, you can add a little bit of water to your magic eraser and use it to remove watercolor paint. So something nice to have. And then I know we don't typically use white in watercolor, but sometimes you just want to add some highlights back in, or you want to add, just some bold white, or replace white that you might have painted over. Whatever reason, there are a few options. I really like the Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. This is actually an ink. It comes in a semi-solid type of format. You just like watercolor, you use water to activate it, and you can paint, and it's very opaque. And it just comes in this one white color. There's also liquid watercolor. So P.H. Martin also makes a hydrous line. There's a few different types of liquid watercolor, but the hydrous is also a somewhat opaque watercolor, and it doesn't come in many different colors, but I have a bottle of just white here, which is also something that you can use, especially if you want to add white and still be working with watercolor. But it is more opaque. There's also, white ink you could use, and then a lot of watercolor artists also like to work with gouache. So I just have a tube of white gouache. You can activate it just like you do with watercolor. It works very similarly. Again, right straight out of the tube, it's going to be opaque. So you do want to, mix it with water, and then you use this right out of the tube. But some options if you want to add some highlights back in. I also think it's really nice to have a porcelain palette. I do have a few of these. I like to mix up different colors, and you see I still have paint left here on my palette. That's because this watercolor paint is still good. All you have to do is add water and reactivate this. So I actually have a few of these porcelain palettes, and they clean up really easily, but I do kind of tend to keep some paint in there because why waste good paint, right? And then I also think it's fun to have a dip pen, and I like a glass dip pen. I see, why would you use this in watercolor? Well, if you want to make some fine lines, you could definitely use it for that, but just like a quill pen, you just take this glass dip pen and you can dip it into liquid watercolor ink, whatever. Doesn't seem to work very good for masking fluid. Masking fluid's a little thick, but definitely something you could use with like the hydrous watercolor. You just dip it in and it writes just like a ballpoint pen would, and I really think that this is useful for signing your artwork. So again, nothing you really need, but something nice to have, really nice to have. And then last one in my list here is a color wheel. This is just one I picked up at my art store, but it's really nice when you're working with watercolor and you're starting to learn how to mix colors, knowing which ones are opposite of each other on the color wheel, so you know how to neutralize, or kind of knowing if a color is leaning more warm or cool. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in my next video, where you don't necessarily have to go out to your art supply store or online to buy one of these. In my next video of this series, we're actually going to make our own color wheel. So stay tuned for that video. If you haven't checked out the others in this series, go ahead and check that out right now. But don't forget to support my video by liking, subscribing for future content, and check out that Watercolor for Real Beginners Facebook group. Happy painting!